Thanks to all of you. Thanks to you, Betty, to Marianne, to Karen. It's very an honor to return to University of Florida this way, to give a presentation to this class. I have nothing but positive things to say about my experience as a graduate student. It was an amazing experience. I look back on it very fondly. I have to be careful. I mean, there's the Florida State University of Florida issue, but now like Florida International University is kind of that younger thing coming up, and they don't take kindly to me like rah-rah in the Gator side, but I can't help it. Sometimes I do it. But yes, I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Paraguay. I started my training in 1998. Ended up staying until early 2002 because I stayed as the environmental sector coordinator because I enjoyed it so much. And I actually, in large part, I went to University of Florida due to the Peace Corps influence. And I didn't know about Karen at the time, but the vice director told me about Karen, told me that she was at University of Florida, and suggested that when I left Peace Corps, if I was interested in graduate school, that I go talk with her. And I actually went, I believe it was the second Working in Forests in the Tropics conference, and actually got to meet her in person. And that just kind of set the ball rolling. At the time, I came back from Paraguay, and I was working for Conservation International for a year in their conservation coffee program. All in the mind, keeping in the back of my head that I wanted to go to graduate school at University of Florida. And I was very happy that I did in the end. It was very serendipitous that all of that happened at once to lead me to Karen as my advisor. And she actually invited me to go to, I was dead set on going back to Paraguay to do my master's research. And Karen was like, you know, that's great. I understand you love Paraguay, but I really would like it. This was the summer prior to starting my degree of the master's program, that she suggested I come down to Acre, where a lot of people at that time were working in terms of students, as well as Karen and Marianne were conducting research down there as well. And that kind of set the ball rolling with Acre. And I also had not planned to stay for a PhD, but she convinced me otherwise as well. So I'm very happy all of this happened at the right time in my life. And so today I'm going to go a little bit into the research that I've continued to do post graduation from University of Florida. But just to kind of serve as the basis for this discussion on evaluating contributions of the type of research that we do, the applied ecological research, to smallholder forest management. Because since my time as a Peace Corps volunteer, it's something that I've always kind of, I try to always maintain that, make sure that whatever we're doing on the ground, the time that we're investing, it has applications on the ground with day-to-day management practices. And through my experience with C4, really started thinking more about the policy level. And I just want to give a shout out. This first photograph is Hideki Koegura with one of the concessionaires that worked with us. This is Doña Felicitas, who has since, and we can get into this discussion a little bit later, she quote unquote sold her concession, which technically you're not supposed to do in Peru, but it does happen because she was getting older, and this woman was out in the forest during harvesting season on a regular basis. And I think in this picture, she's probably 72, 73. And she just told me that she couldn't do it anymore. She had obligations in Puerto Maldonado, in the capital. But Hideki was one of our practicantes, one of our interns. And these kids were over 20 over the course of time, current at the time, or former UNAMAD, that's the local university of Puerto Maldonado. Students that came out and worked with us. And in large part, this was a successful project because of their dedication and the fact that we were hiring local students to go in and work in these concessions. So just to start out the talk, and I'm sorry if I'm looking this way, it's because I have this up on my screen. If we can move to the next slide. So this is taken from actually this is a PhD, my PhD project, which was also, these were both, my master's and my PhD were done in Puerto Diaz, the agro-extractive reserve, just very close to the Hondonia border. It's right along the Rio Abuna, which separates Bolivia from Acre. And as Betty mentioned, I looked at impacts of timber harvesting in bamboo-dominated forests. And just very briefly, this type of forest has two species of guadua that dominate these areas. And this is across the Madre de Dios, Pando, Bolivia, and Acre, Brazil region. And it's very low basal area compared to other types of forests without the bamboo. And you can see that's a Dipteryx species that has been cut right there. You can kind of, it's very messy. Not an easy place to work. but I just wanted to, I wanted to show this photograph just to kind of, from my context of working with community members, and I think a lot of us who have been students at the University of Florida, the whole community connection is very important. And one way or another, the community members are always involved in our projects. And then if you move to the next slide, this is an old one. I had to dig this out. Shona, I don't know if she can see this. I don't think she's on right now. But this was taken when we both got TCD practitioner grants to go back and return our research results to the community members in Puerto Diaz, because Shona also did her master's work.
That's great.
It was really sweet to see that. I mean, and that's Mary Menton, who was a postdoc with Marianne, who now running her own consulting company in Oxford, England. And she also worked for C4 for several years, and that's her baby, who is now not such a baby anymore. I think she might be close to being a teenager, Anya. But so that part of this, and I really stress this because you all are at University of Florida, you're graduate students there, that emphasis on returning research results and having the ability to do it, because it all comes down to funding at the end of the day. And TCD definitely provided that opportunity for students. And for that, I'm very grateful, because that's something that I've tried to continue since leaving the institution. If we can move to the next slide. And this is also, this is from that same presentation, you know, using the charts like Karen mentioned. That was something that I think she might have picked up in Peace Corps in Paraguay, maybe not. I know I did. That was a very easy way to translate the information to community members. And then the next slide, this is, and in fact, the blonde hair guy in the other photo, and you can see him here, that's my husband, Chris Barrelato, who got his PhD at University of Michigan, worked in French Guiana, really great botanist. And what we did here was we organized with CTA, the NGO with whom I was partnering as a graduate student. We organized training for materos. So all these guys were tree identifiers, you term parataxonomists, who didn't get formal training at university, but from practical experience in the forest. And these guys, many of them are multi-generational forest dwellers and have a lot of just a lot of local ecological knowledge that they've built up over time. And what we were doing was working with them to identify families, genera, and this was another great way to translate some of that information from the project and our expertise on the ground. So there are a variety of ways that you can do this as a student, as a, you know, once you leave graduate school. But my quandary has always been, are we sure like that information is translatable? I mean, do we have a way to make sure to evaluate whether or not, once we leave, that some of that information that we presented is being used, and how do you encourage that use, or if it's even possible, you know, depending on what we've studied, what questions we looked at. So this was just a figure that I've taken out of an article that was, you may already be familiar with this. This is Amy Duchel's paper from 2008. This was the special issue in, I'm sorry, yeah, advance the next frame. From Biotropica, graduate students and knowledge exchange with local stakeholders, possibilities of preparation. And I thought this was a great paper because this kind of condensed a lot of our experiences as graduate students at the University of Florida, how we were sharing that information with local stakeholders and how that occurs. And it goes both ways. So it's not just coming from the academic side to locals on the ground, but and I know this, you know, just from my personal experience, because I also conducted a series of interviews on the ground to kind of generate knowledge for my part from the local landowners about their knowledge of local ecology, about the bamboo dominated forest. And this can be a very fruitful activity for not just graduate students, for just researchers in general. That it's definitely a two-way street in terms of how we share knowledge, and that's the ideal. And that same issue, just before we start going into my experiences in Madre Dios, I just kind of want to give a little bit more background information on where the literature is going at this point. And some of you already may be familiar with a lot of this work. This is from Patricia Shanley, who at the time of this article was still with C4, and I believe now she's with Plants and People. She's a great researcher, a lot of experience in the Brazilian Amazon. And her whole point was that for the most part, all of these forest dwellers, they are outside of the loop of information, which is a problem because they're the ones managing. We know how, it's a very high percentage, the number of community smallholders that are managing the forests that are on the ground. And all of this information, all this data is being gathered, but it's not necessarily making to the people who have more of a possibility of making a difference. And so you can see on the right-hand side, this positive performance assessment, that's more what she terms in this paper, blind science. So where there's really an emphasis on producing a lot of papers, getting the information out quickly, because that's what, at the end of the day, I mean, for those of you who are thinking about life on the academic track, that's really what's emphasized. And I think more and more that institutions are kind of thinking about ways, some institutions anyway, and how to encourage this type of reflection on the research and what impact it may have on policy. But by far and large, that we still have a situation where we are expected to produce a lot of papers, but in the meantime, that may not necessarily be conducive to this ground up system, which is shown on the left-hand side. This bottom-up cyclical communication is what she calls it, or contextualized science, where you have user input, you have input from people on the ground, you engage with partners on a regular basis. You're looking at these potential impacts of your research. So I thought that was a nice background for this subject as well. And this is just really quickly, this is from an area that's from a group of researchers, they're marine scientists. This came from Ocean and Coastal Management, because those who are studying marine science are also thinking about this type of thing. They looked at, what they did was a review looking at the words knowledge exchange or knowledge transfer, and looking at reviewed manuscripts published since 1970 to see how often these terms are used. And you can see that there is an increase in that. So it's definitely showing across the board, and this is across all scientific disciplines that have an environmental focus. You can see that the interest has increased substantially, which is a good thing, because we are using public funds. We should be interested in finding out how we can transfer this knowledge to the public, to policy, and as well on the ground managers. And here, just very quickly, this is conceptual diagram illustrating ways in which knowledge exchange occurs between scientists and decision makers. And they mention in this legend that the representation is based on resilience thinking. And I think that is an important thing for those of us who have a background in ecology. I consider myself someone who has interdisciplinary interests, and that is, I've worked with a lot with social scientists. I think that's very important as an ecologist. I have engaged in some interdisciplinary research, data collection, but by far and large, I've been trained as an ecologist. Nonetheless, some of the stuff that we're going to be talking about today, I think a lot of it draws from the social sciences, so it's very important for those of us who do come from an ecological background that we pay attention to these type of recommendations and these type of theories, because they can have a substantial, a definite positive influence on our work and how we conduct it and how we transfer that knowledge in the end. And they are juxtaposing research organizations with, and that would include universities, academic universities, with decision-making organizations, policymakers, and funders and donors, because a lot of times, what we do on the ground has everything to do with where the money is coming from. And sometimes, we're in a particular lane of research, a particular area of research that is emphasized or favored in the funding world, and sometimes not. And so I think that the funders and the donors definitely have a responsibility in thinking about this type of issue as well. Are there any questions at this point? I'll keep going. Okay. So this gets me to one of my current research regions. I crossed the border into Peru when I started working for C4. It was a region I always heard about. It actually worked a little bit with Stephen Pertz's group, doing some botanical surveys with Chris and some botanists from the local herbarium in Puerto Maldonado when they started opening up the road and paving it in Madre Dios. And this is the Interoceanic Highway that does, and we'll see an image here that goes into Acre as well as Pando, but you can see it in this image, this map, B and C. When you look at that corner, and the C is up right on the border with Acre, right? And then B is down below where it starts going into Cusco. And you can see the deforestation, this deforestation that you're looking at right now along that highway. And it was always a little bit open to a certain extent. And I included this photo showing the road in 2007 in Peru, going right up to the edge, the forest going right up to the edge of the forest, the road, excuse me, in Madre Dios, when you entered into Iberia. That has changed. It was always a surprise to me coming from Brazil, because those of you who know Acre, Brazil, even though it has maintained a pretty good forest cover compared to other states in the Amazon basin, even at that time when I was working over 10 years ago in Acre, you had to go pretty far off the road to get to the forest edge, right? Because a lot of it was opened up for cattle. At that time, at least in Peru, that wasn't the case. In Madre Dios, the forest was coming up right to the edge of the road in many places. And once they paved that road, deforestation rates went up very, very high. And so right now in Peru, this is information from the Amazon Conservation Association that just came out in the last year, that it has one of the worst deforestation rates recently in Peru. And this is a problem. So that area around B is more due to gold extraction. Some of it legal, a lot of it illegal gold extraction. And the area around C is primarily agriculture, not cattle so much, although some cattle is popping up. It's not popular to the extent that it is in Brazil. But there's a lot of cacao, a lot of papaya, and a lot of corn production that's opening up those areas. So deforestation is becoming more of an issue in Madre Dios. I'm going to the next slide. Nonetheless, Madre Dios is one of those very interesting places to look at this idea of multiple use forest management. But what I mean by multiple use forest management is that, and this has been termed, this is a term that's been around for 20 plus years. It's gained some popularity a few years ago in the literature, but it's where you're taking multiple products from the forest, including non-timber forest products like Brazil nuts. At least when I first started in Brazil, there was still rubber collection going on, and definitely timber. And so you see all of that bright green. And this is from a paper from Andrea Chavez, another University of Florida graduate. These are concessions that allow for production of Brazil nut and timber. And so that is how I got involved with this work with C4. And so the integration of timber and Brazil nut harvest, as Karen mentioned, is a complicated one because, and I'm going to the next slide. And these are a couple of team members. This is Hideki and Eric's they're both, you've already seen a photo of Hideki. This was Eric's who was organizing the team on the ground, and they're measuring a Brazil nut. They were out in these concessions for long periods of time collecting data on both the logging gaps and the Brazil nut production. That tree on the top left corner is Peltagine, which is Purple Heart on the international commercial market. This type of tree, and we just, in the last year and a half, we put in 12 gentry plots in 2 of the concessions. We'd like to continue with more, but we found no Peltagine left. And we found no commercial-sized Tababuya, and we found no commercial-sized Dipteryx, which is called Brazilian teak, on the market. And that's actually one of the more popular timber species in Peru right now because of the Chinese market. The Chinese buy more timber from Peru than anybody else, but the United States is right behind. And unfortunately, both of those countries, they have signed agreements with Peru saying that they're not going to take any illegal logs. But nonetheless, more than 80%, it's an estimation of the timber coming out of this region is illegal. And it's a lot, even when it's legal, it's high grading. So you take a lot of the hardwoods that you might know, Sweetania, the mahogany, Peltagine, Purple Heart, Tababuya, green ebony on the commercial markets. Those have along the road, at least, they have largely disappeared. So these are areas where they still collect Brazil nut for sure, and where we conducted our study, where they're still harvesting for timber, but they've made the switch to what they call Madera Blanda species, so the softwood. So this is a lot of Ceiba, the Malvaceae family, Maticia, which is, I think, Sapote on the commercial market, and Cedrolinga, which is in the Lacedaceae family, so it's a cousin to the Bertholacea. And those have become more of the popular ones that are harvested because that's what's left. And that's a Brazil nut seedling on the bottom. So we don't know. The question was, when we went into this research, how is this timber harvesting having an impact on Brazil nut production? Because that's a question a lot of the concessionaires had. And so even though, and you can see here, this is from 2014, Andrea Chavez did this a few years ago for us, and she's fantastic with these remote sensing analyses. And here, this was in the latter part of our research study. There's only 3 concessions highlighted right there, closer to Alegria. But you can see how heavily forested it still is. And the reason I put this up, you can see the Rio Branco area just to the north. That's in Brazil. A lot of deforestation. And then Bolivia on the right-hand side, not so much deforestation. But you can see the deforestation along the road. But by and large, it looks like the forest cover is intact in those Brazilian concessions, which it is. The question is what's going on underneath. And that's always been one of my questions. And that's something I'm not going to talk about too much right now, because I know we're limited on time, but I just wanted to show this. This is also Andrea's analyses for us for 2 of the concessions where we conducted plots. This is a land change trajectory, and for those of you who have taken remote sensing or of this type of analysis, that we've actually gained forest cover in these Brazilian concessions. Each one of these concessions is about 500 hectares or a little bit more. And that they've actually gained forest cover in some areas, haven't lost a lot of forest cover. And here, but we know that, just going back to this, that we know that the forest underneath has been highly degraded since the 1970s. In the 1970s, the timber was primarily Swietenia and Cedrela, Spanish cedar. And now they've harvested out a lot of the hardwood species, and now they're moving towards more of the so-called Madeira blended species. So going on to the next slide. This is just a location of, this was from the paper that you all read. Those highlighted areas in red are the concessions that we worked in. There are 2 that are towards the north, going towards Acre and Alerta. And actually that forest up there is bamboo dominated. So there are guava species up there. The ones to the below that in the south, around Alegria, are not bamboo dominated, but they are all total over 4,000 hectares. And just as a side note, many years ago, the government, they went through and they mapped all the reproductive Brazil nuts in there. So everything about 40 centimeters DBH. So just to give you some insight into the Brazil nut project and the history. So I think in the paper that you read, the Ramirez Belcher paper, that is actually November 2012 where the concessionaire meetings occurred. So my apologies on that. But the end of 2012, where the C4 group went out and met with concessionaires from Alegria and Alerta. They met with the organizations. They work with these, they definitely are organized. They're not, they manage their concessions, and they have 40-year concessions that cannot be sold or transferred without the government's permission, but it does happen. They met with them, talked to them about their project idea, wanted to get an idea of who would be interested in participating. And they threw out the idea of impacts of timber harvesting, but just to give you an idea of how delicate of a process this is, even the people with whom we ended up working were harvesting illegally from time to time because it is so complicated to go through the government. I know this occurs in Acre, Brazil as well. And that sometimes people are just like, if they wait long enough, they're just like, you know what, I'm just going to go ahead and cut this because my family needs, I have a son or a daughter who needs to go to college, or I have a child who's sick. Sometimes they need the cash up front and quickly. And so if they have to go through the process of waiting to be given the official permission to harvest timber, they're just going to go bypass that and do it anyway, because they have buyers, constant buyers who will take it out. And so they got this information from the concessionaires about who would be interested. And then from September to November 2012, based on those responses, they had a team. It was a young student from England who went out with Eric's, and they remapped a lot of the concessions. They had the information from the other local NGOs and the government showing where the Brazil nut trees were. They confirmed those locations. They also mapped new and older logging gaps in those concessions. And then I came on in November 2012 and designed the study to look at the impacts of harvesting on Brazil nut production. And we recruited our field team from UNAMAD, from the forest engineering program. And then from yes, go ahead.
Oh, you're good.
Okay, so from January to May of 2013 was our first year of collecting fruit data that was counting fruit as well as as weighing the nuts. And when I say May 2013, like Karen mentioned, this is done during the rainy season. That's when the fruits are falling, but we went, and so that's really until March. You know, no one is allowed officially to live in the concessions. They mostly live in the pueblos or in Puerto Maldonado, the capital of Madre de Dios. But the workers, the Brazil nut collectors, go out during the rainy season, probably from January to March, more or less. Some start earlier in December because of this fear of losing their Brazil nuts to thieves, which does happen on a frequent basis. But our people went back in April and May and revisited those sites to collect more, to see what was fallen. Because, you know, there was they probably did more than a 90% sweep between January and March, the Brazil nut harvesters. And so our guys went back in and made sure that they collected any additional fruits that had fallen post-March. And so we got what we feel like is 100% counting in terms of the number of fruits. So from May to November 2013, after the Brazil nut fruit production ended, that data collection period ended, we were logging new gaps and skid trails because they were always occurring. And I failed to mention that during this time, there's no cutting cycle per se, like in Brazil. In Brazil, you know, it's 25 to 30 years, then you wait 25 to 30 years to go back in and harvest timber. Here, it's like people going in continuously to the same area year after year. And now they're doing it in quadrants, which is a step up from where it used to be, but nonetheless, it's not quite as sustainable as waiting a longer period, but waiting a longer period, 25 to 30 years, is not economically viable for a lot of these guys. So anyway, just a side note. In December 2013 to May 2014, we had another fruit production data collection period. And then from May to December 2014, we collected in 3 concessions in Alegria, juveniles between 10 and 40 centimeters CBH. And it took a long time because that was 100% inventory, because we were trying to get that was for a separate paper that was looking at the spatial aggregation of the juvenile and the adult population. And then from July to September 2016, since I've started here at FIU, was gentry plot installation in 2 of the concessions in Alegria. And September 2016 was when we had this third-party assessment of the Brazil nut study. The Brazil nut study as relating to the production only. And so just very quickly, because I know we're running short, there were several covariates that we were collecting in the field for this production study, including those that were more the biophysical in terms of soil, canopy openness, local basal area, nearest conspecific neighbor, data on the individual tree, diameter, crown formation, much as Karen mentioned earlier. And we looked at timber extraction, physical damage. We did not look at decreased pollinator movement, but now Chris Keller's group from ETH in Zurich, Switzerland, is looking at this, but not in the logged areas. They're working in the Tamaulipas National Reserve because it's very politically very complicated to work where they are harvesting timber in Madre de Dios. But we also looked at increased access to light. So we took light measurements in these areas. And this is just some of the photos from some of the data collection. And we took for the production level, those gaps from 1 to 5 years old. And the reason we didn't take older gaps, and there are a lot of older gaps, I mean, some dating back, you know, a couple of decades, because we thought that the more recent gaps would potentially have more of an influence on the production levels. And we only had 2 years of data. So it's this, the funding for this came through USAID. And USAID at some point decided that they were not going to fund anything that had anything to do with timber harvesting. Unless we were talking specifically about illegal harvesting, which we did not want to do because of the safety issues with the students. So unfortunately, the data collection for fruit production ended, and it is, as Karen can tell you, a very expensive process, especially because, I mean, if we go to the next slide, I mean, these are large concessions. You can't see them in relation to the roads, but, you know, to get into these concessions, you have to take a motorcycle everywhere. And so it takes time as well. And it's very nerve-wracking in terms of safety for me as, like, you know, these young students, 20-something-olds going every day into the concessions on motorcycles was very nerve-wracking, but no accidents, thank goodness. But so here's just, you can kind of see an example of the collection of the data So those, I mean, we took at least 100 trees from each concession. We did not do 100% inventory because the harvesters were not going to 100% of these concessions, especially we had one that was over 1,000 hectares. It was just enormous. And so you see on the white circles, those are all the Brazil nut individuals above 40 centimeters CVH, all the reproductive ones that were not taken in terms of their fruit production data. The red ones were the ones that we collected data for. And then we have those little green triangles are all the log gaps, 1 to 5 years. But there are more log gaps since that time because people have gone back in and cut more. And there are also older gaps that we did not put on these maps. Okay, next slide. And just very briefly, you can see that there was no, this is the combined 2013-2014 data, no effect of nut weight for a distance to cut stump. However, I just want to point, the next slide shows the violin plots. These are the 5 concessions. We had one concession where the guy was harvesting for up to 4 trees per hectare. And that was when we broke it down into individual concessions, we did see an impact of, and this was the combined data for both years, we did see an impact of the higher intensity. I mean, 4 trees per hectare compared to other areas of the Amazon is not that much, but then again, like these forests don't have a lot of harvestable trees. And from our gentry plot data, which we haven't published yet, we're hoping to do that soon, there's about 60 cubic meters per hectare. And that's included, and that's about what I found in Acre for the bamboo dominated forests. And this is not dominated by bamboo. So in theory, this should be higher basal area than bamboo dominated forest, but for commercial harvestable timber volume, it is not. So that is a concern. So that's something we just wanted to keep an eye on. I mean, unfortunately, we did not have the funding continuing data collection. In the ideal situation, you would have many, many years to look at this, and you do need this in order to have a comprehensive view. So major findings: distance to cut stump had no impact on fruit production, found no general effect of logging, but we did find, as Karen mentioned, concessionaires are avoiding Brazil nut groves and reproductive individuals during logging operations, which was a really nice finding, because that's what we were getting from the interviews that they were telling us, and we found out, lo and behold, that we confirmed those interview responses. So I'm going to skip over this real quickly, just kind of some future questions. I did want to point out the fact sheet. If you move forward a couple of, yeah, right there. Thank you. This is, C4 is very policy focused, having an impact on policy, and these are the fact sheets they put out in every country that they work in the local language. And this was a fact sheet about our project. Now, at some point, you go on to the next slide very quickly, and I'm going to try to finish up in the next 5 minutes. This is a paper that was, and this was done with C4's knowledge. C4 did ask for this to be done. This is a group of researchers from Canada, and they are interested in transdisciplinary research. So this is what this is like where they take this type of these ecological studies, looking at it from using some of the techniques skills from the social science side, and looking to see if there is an impact of this research on policy and local forest managers' management practices, so to speak. So this is transdisciplinary research. It aims to integrate different types of knowledge, values, and interests. You go to the next slide. These are 3 of the components that they look at to measure whether or not if you had your research was relevant, if it was legitimate, and if it was credible. And so I'm going to tell you, I knew this was happening. I was interviewed by these researchers, and it is humbling to have your research dissected like this, but I think it is a good thing in the end, because you do want, at the end of the day, you want your research to have an impact, and we really struggled with how to make sure. And I didn't mention, we did present these results to the community, and it was presented to UNAMAD and NGOs in Puerto Maldonado. My partner, Manuel Guariguata, from C4, did present this with policymakers in Lima. And it did get some attention because they initially changed the forestry law to include the buffer of 100 meters, which was controversial because our study didn't specifically address that issue. The finding that we had out of this issue of looking at Brazil nut production levels and the influence from timber harvesting. But in the future, looking at this idea of a buffer zone would be, I think, very beneficial. But I don't think that we had enough data to be able to implement that type of regulation at that level. But this whole conversation is important, talking about having a buffer zone, because people are already doing it. But it made people very angry that the policymakers enforce this on the ground. But now they've since taken it out, but it is something that somebody at some point should look at in terms of thinking about this buffer zone. But it has to be done in a different way in terms of looking at different distances. We just found that on average, our concessionaires were staying away from these Brazil nut groves. But whether or not 100 meters is the best case scenario, or it could be 50 meters, we don't know, because our research didn't address that question specifically. But just going back to this slide, you can see that we did rank high in some areas in terms of the socially relevant research problem. We did not rank high in some areas, like you look at the GISME for research as ethical. And that's just because we didn't have a set standard of ethical requirements for the research, because in ecological research, it hasn't been really developed. Like in social sciences, you have the IRB approval, which is great, because that's to make sure that everybody stays within the ethical standards that we should all conduct ourselves with social research. But to date, like in terms of ecological research, it hasn't really been developed. At best, we didn't use it. And so that's why I think we got a 0 on research as ethical mark. And just this figure 3, the next slide, you can see that the Brazil Nut Project outcomes, a lot of partial achievements and achievements that we came in terms of impacts, including Brazil Nut Study contributes to science investigation agenda in the region. Students involved had enhanced skills. I think that's where we made one of our biggest impacts, is on these students who then went on to work for the Forest Service. They went on to work for the regional government, and they had an intensive amount of time in the field working with landowners. And now they're in positions where they can actually take some of that knowledge of the time in the field and apply it on the ground, because they are in positions of power in Puerto Maldonado. So I think, in some ways, in terms of that was an unexpected outcome, but it was a very nice one to see. But in other areas, we still haven't made quite the impact of this research that we wanted to. And one of those in the top hand, at the top left-hand side, optimize multiple management and concessions. Our research, I don't think, was in long enough time that we really could have a huge impact on how people are managing the forests. And that would require some more information and more data. And obviously that means more funding in this type of research. And the last slide that I have is research effectiveness. And you can see that in terms of the significant outcome was not so great, according to these researchers, which I totally understand why they came to that conclusion. Although a lot of the critiques came from, they were only in the end able to interview 2 of the concession owners out of the 5 that we worked with. And I'm still not, apparently the other ones refused to talk with them, and I'm not sure why. And they also included an illegal logger. I'm not sure how they made that distinction. They didn't explain that in the methods. So I mean, me personally, I definitely appreciated this exercise in really taking apart the research and seeing if it had an impact on the ground, what kind of impact it had on the ground. And they did something very similar with Rosa Cosio's work, who was also at University of Florida with Karen's lab. She was a consultant with C4 several years ago and looked at timber harvesting in Brazil nut concessions, and they just recently went back in and tried to look at the impact that that report that she came out with had on the ground in Madre Dios. And so I mean, you all may have drawn your own conclusions from this Ramirez paper, but from the standpoint of a person who was involved with the research project that they selected, I think it was a good exercise for us to kind of think about different ways of evaluating our research on the ground and trying to decide if it's really being used. And it's something that eventually we should follow up on and try to continue doing in future research endeavors on the ground. But I think I've run out of time. I don't know if there's any time for, and the next slide is the question slide, if there's any time for questions. But I thank you very much for your attention.
Great.